Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, anyone watching live now or later, watching the video or listening to the podcast version. It is a pleasure, as usual, to have a guest. And tonight I am joined by Mr. Tom Grimwood. Tom, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I was just saying, it's Friday night. I've got my glass of wine. I've got some good company.
Well,
what more can I ask for?
debatable, but we'll see. We'll see. So I was going to say that these days, when I am approached to review a new book by a new author, I think sometimes now I'm more interested by the author than by the book. And in your case, a social philosophy professor from the UK, it's like, I have to read this book. I have to talk to this person. So for a complete ignorant like me, what is social philosophy?
What is social philosophy? I like how you said just before we went live, it's nice on a Friday night to not talk about work.
Sorry, yeah, you're right.
And the first thing you ask me, no, it's a good question. So social philosophy, in its shortest version, is philosophy that's concerned with social issues. What I would say is a lot of more traditional philosophy starts with theory and then thinks about how theory can change the world, how our thoughts can change the world. What I'm really interested in is how social events or social happenings or contradictions or tensions or things just make us think differently, and how we might use events in the world to reshape our theories. So that's what I've done with a lot of my work, and my work kind of straddles very applied stuff around health and social care and social work and how philosophy relates with them, but also the parts of philosophy that sometimes get a bit forgotten. So I write on things like stupidity and how we understand stupidity or how we use the term stupid. I like writing on cliches, which I won't say if that comes. I won't ask if that comes out in the novel at all. But I've written some books on cliches, some stuff on irony, some stuff on silence, the things that we don't normally talk about in philosophy, but I think are just as important in helping us make sense of the world. So that's what social philosophy is.
So it's you're kind of taking sort of like the opposite route. You're starting from sort of observable, sort of social, like you said, social events, and see how it shapes our mind. Because, like I said to you before, I had a quick cheeky browse at your profile at university, and you have some very interestingly titled working paper on COVID.
Yeah. Yes, about the politics of intelligence in COVID, about COVID and COVIDiots.
That's the one. Yes, yes. Sorry for anyone. There's a few people lurking in the chat, so please, say hello, put your questions there. But for people that I think these things are quite interesting. For anyone that wants to find your work, where can they find your more academic work? And then we'll start talking about the novel.
Right. Well, probably the best place to start is not that I have my books to hand, but this book here, The Problem with Stupid. This is available on Zero Books. It was actually writing this book that led me to get my novel published, the first novel published, which is why I mention it in particular, because it's the same printing house. You can also find me on my web profile. I've got quite a lot of open access articles. So if you're interested, please look. If there's anything behind a paywall, then always feel free to email me at my Cumbria address, and I can always pass on copies if people are interested.
Brilliant. No, I think I definitely want to check a couple of those articles and essays, articles, working papers.
Articles, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, you've already sort of given us the bridge there. So how do you go from writing about stupidity and COVID to a fantasy novel for young adults?
So I've always liked stories. I've always liked writing stories. When I was a kid, I used to write and write and write. for my own entertainment, really. I remember my parents used to get mad at me because whenever we watched a film, I'd watch the first half, and then I'd go out and play the second half. And so, like, for years, I never knew how Star Wars ended, because I'd always get halfway through and then think, I've got an idea of how this can end, you know. And I always used to write when I was doing my PhD. I'd write just to, empty my mind of the work stuff and just to entertain myself, really. And then I had kids, and a lot of these ideas that I used to have as a kid, I became bedtime stories and things like that. And then one year I decided I'd write a book for my son. For his birthday is on Christmas Day, so it was a joint Christmas birthday present. I thought, I'll write him a book, and I'll get it bound like a proper book, and like it's a proper book. So I did that, and he really liked it, and I thought, that's good. I'm a good parent there. Yeah. Next year, he said, I'm really looking forward to getting another book.
Damn.
And so every year, I've got into this habit now of writing him a novel, and it's a bit of a challenge, but I like to, it's good. It's something to focus on. It's something to concentrate on. So I've written him this book, and one year I wrote him this book called Vanisher, and he took it into school because he was reading it, and some of his friends wanted to know what this book was, so he lent it around to a few people, and one of his friends in particular, she came up to me after school one day and said, you have to publish that. You have to publish it properly. And then I didn't realize that person's mum was also reading the book, and was messaging me about different plot points. They said, you got to publish it. And I had tried to publish some of my earlier fiction that was perhaps a bit, it didn't fit quite into a genre quite as well, and it tripped up a bit. But as it was, at the time, I was working with Collective Ink, with Zero Publishing House, and I noticed they had this other publishing title for young adults, and I thought, well, I like working with Collective Ink. I like the platform they've got. I like that, I've got this book. People seem to like it. I'll stick it in. And surprisingly, they really liked it as well. And it was a surprise to me because, like I say, I always write really just to entertain myself and just to kind of, tell myself a story and obviously tell my son a story and my sister as well. And that's how it came about, really.
Because I was just thinking, I was going to ask you, why did you choose to write for the young adult market? But clearly we have the answer there. But as you were telling the story of how it came about, I had echoes of Tolkien in my head, because that's how The Hobbit came about, isn't it?
Yeah,
It was the story he used to tell his children, and eventually. So I was just thinking about that, which is a great story, by the way.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking about how you came about.
Oh, sorry. I thought.
But obviously,
I don't. Yeah.
So, what I find difficult, and when I was reviewing the book, is that obviously it's not coming out for publication until February, isn't it?
End of January, 28th.
End of January, yeah. Right. So I did not want to spoil any plot points, and I find it difficult to do, because if you're going to do a review of a book and not unpick it, it ends up being a subjective. I enjoyed it, but if you kind of really go into it, I don't know I don't want to spoil anything for anyone watching, thinking about getting the book. But so you got your story. It's like a sort of like a heist sort of story in a fantasy setting. But I've been trying to figure out, and in my head, there is a deeper layer of meaning in the story that I haven't quite pinpointed. Am I wrong? And is it just a story to entertain young adults, or is that are you trying to say something else?
I think I saw you say that in the review, and then my son turned around to me and said, "Is there a deeper meaning?" You know, so thanks for that. No, it's I think, like, one of the reasons I like writing for that age group is partly because, like, I'm still a bit of a kid, yeah, you know, but you know, these are the kind of stories that I like, and you've got a lot of flexibility for that audience to play out some ideas. I do get quite frustrated with a lot of the tropes of that sort of audience and age group. You know, hopefully not being too unfair to such, you know, because there's so many books in that audience. But you know, I don't always like the protagonist being hugely innocent about things. I don't like the idea that just because they're young, they won't have some cunning and they won't have some guile, even if they're just learning about the world. You know, so there's a few things that, you know, I don't set out and think I'm writing this for a younger audience. So I think, you know, maybe I tone down some of the violence or some of the, you know, but I don't want to shy away from the sort of more dramatic twists or things like that. So, I mean, I think if we take it right back, the book is set in, like you say, a fantasy land, but in a way, it's what I'd probably call a kind of late capitalist fantasy land. It's what happens after these fantasy lands have kind of encountered making money and got to that kind of slightly, you know, end of history type point where.
Because I suppose what we can actually say is right at the beginning of the book. Right, we can. So
yeah, we can set in without ruining it.
Right. So there's this world where kind of there's no place to go adventuring. So you got all these adventurers that are kind of looking for a job. Where can we go adventuring? And then this, I don't know, I can't remember the time. This king builds this giant maze filled with creatures and treasure, so adventurers can go adventuring, so they can have a job, basically.
Yeah.
So the whole premise is quite peculiar in and of itself, and there is a catch, but I'm not gonna spoil anymore. So I think that's the starting. So that was like, oh, there's gotta be something here. Like,
I mean, I think and some of it is, it's like you say, it's a fantasy land. I was looking at some. I think I was going through some old Steve Jackson, Ian Livingstone fighting fantasy books, you know, and thinking, this is great. There's all these adventurers wandering around getting money and all this stuff. What happens when they've killed all the monsters, though? You know, what happens when? And at some point, once you've got a certain level of civilization, I don't think people are going to like magic anymore. You know, so again, in this land, magic is kind of illegal. It's, you know, it's not, and people don't trust it either. You know, so you've got essentially quite a normal society, but living in this land that was full of monsters. So then, like you say, all the people who would be adventurers, and you've got to imagine there's not a lot of jobs around if someone wants to be an adventurer. So you have this citadel created on top of a dungeon that itself sits on top of a much sort of set of older ruins. And you have to, it's kind of like someone's created a Las Vegas for adventurers, you know.
I like that.
And the key thing, and again, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler. The key thing about it is people go there and they find their fortune and all this stuff. And they can make all the money in the world. But when they try and leave, they can't really take the money out because they get heavily taxed or it gets taken off them. So it becomes a kind of, you know, self-feeding economy. And, you know, it wasn't particularly set up. I mean, I've had the basis of the story I've had in my head since I was 8 or 9. You know, I think I first came up with this, like, very different. It didn't have a Vanisher in it for a start. You know, the Vanisher was probably the last character to go into the story. But a lot of the others were there in various different guises. And, you know, as I was writing it, was thinking actually a lot of this is just about greed, but about the different forms of greed that people have, because some of it is about the sort of financial greed of the guy who runs the dungeon, but there's a lot of other characters who, you know, they want adventure, or they need adventure, and they have a sort of thirst for it, but it's more like an addiction rather than a, you know, because if they're, you know, some of the characters, they, you know, who are part of the heist, they are legends within the city, but outside the Citadel, they're nothing. You know, they can't just run around killing people like they do in there. You know, so they're just, you know, they're just nobodies really, and that's what kind of gets them hooked into the heist, is because they want that, and throughout the book, a lot of them are sort of wrestling with this of whether they could just go back to you know, being the sort of legendary adventurer within what they know is all a bit of a spectacle and not really real. So yeah, I think that's what, you know, and within that, of course, there's the question of, it's a group of people trying to work together, and how do they trust each other when these underlying kind of forms of addiction or forms of greed are in play, you know. So that's sort of going on under the bonnet, I think, and sometimes quite explicitly, but that's, you know,
yeah. And now that we're talking about it, and now that you're explaining that, and this is why I just love talking about books, and particularly, obviously, if I got the author there, but just gets ideas in my head as you were talking. For some reason, what it was making me think about was that Big Brother TV show, where you had these people in this very artificial environment where they become famous or stars for a brief period of time, and they're trying to stay in that house for as long as possible, because once they leave 2 months later, they are nobodies. No one remembers them. It's that you know, those 15 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's also there's the people in the world who want to get into the Citadel, so they kind of know, you know, when they meet these people, it's so the sort of old heroes, they can't just forget it, because every so often someone's going to come up and say, I remember you, you know, you're this amazing warrior, and they kind of look at themselves and think, I'm not really though. So again, it's this pull for them to go back into the city, and also, you know, it's ultimately a drive for why they want to rob it of its treasure, you know, to kind of get a bit of revenge on what it's done to them. But that obviously plays out during the story.
Yeah, and it's, again, just making me think about things. It's like boxers that always come back to that last fight. That is never the last fight, isn't it? After they know they shouldn't do it, but the lure of the money, that last, you know, big paycheck coming in. So there's all those things. And one thing I enjoyed is like in every stage of the story, in every bit, there is obviously we have a big twist at the end, but there are little twists at every step that I really enjoyed. So we got the initial scene where, you know, you got that sort of classic heist movie planning scene where you're putting the team together, but even there's a twist right at the beginning, and then you got, you know, a few more going down the road. So I found the story very entertaining and very engaging from the word go.
Thank you. I would have to acknowledge as well, when I was writing, I had a friend who also writes short stories and things. A friend called Sarah Pemberton. We used to exchange stories, and I'd send her stuff that I was working on and things like that. And initially, it was always a heist, but it was perhaps going to be a bit more of a start with a big group, and they slowly get whittled down in that kind of classic adventure way. And I presented the sort of group of characters, and I'm quite like, I get bored quite quickly. You know, this is why. I mean, Vanisher is like that. It's not a massive book because I'm not Umberto Eco, but clearly, but like I don't want to spend 5 pages describing the room they've walked into if all they're doing is walking through the room. It's like, they walk through a room. You imagine the rest.
No, because there's something. The book I'm currently reading, To Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams, is the last book in the trilogy. And the book was so long, it had to be split into like 2 books of 800 pages. And to your point, and I've been playing in my head for a week, there's this character that it takes her a page and a half to open a door. Like from the moment someone knocks on the door to the moment she opens the door, it takes a page and a half.
Yeah,
and it's like
just open the door. But what my friend Sarah was very good at, she said she read the characters and then came back and said, "Oh my God, you've got to do like I'm gonna write what they did in the past because I think they knew each other and I think and she started writing little bits, they're not part of the novel. They were just her kind of not like fan fiction, because that wasn't but that kind of, she just sort of took the idea and pushed some things around, and it challenged me to think of to give a bit more depth to the characters, but also to make it much more about let's not have them all just drop off one by one. Let's have them all. I mean, let's have a sort of core group who stick around for a long time, and it's actually about how they interact with each other, which made it fleshed out some, but also helped me get them through some of the challenges they had. Because sometimes when you're writing, you get to a point and you're like, what are they going to do? How, what's an interesting way for them to get through that? What's one of them going to say? What's one of the, it was through, talking about the characters to someone else, I kind of got, oh, actually, no, I do know what they would say in this. I do, I can kind of see them playing it all out. So yeah. But also what that did was, just to go back to your question, it sort of enabled some twists to happen, because starting to build up how each one of them was going to approach the heist, and how each one of them, sometimes, it sounds a bit silly, but sometimes I was quite surprised by the twists themselves. I'd just be writing and suddenly it'd be like, and then this has happened, So certainly the big twist, it was a bit of I just suddenly, that's what's going to happen now. It sort of took me by surprise. And
okay, so you didn't have it all mapped out. Just let it take you places.
I had the idea, and I had one or two things I wanted to happen, usually when I write books, I have a general sense of where it's going to end up, but not necessarily all the sort of, because once I've mapped it out, I get a bit bored of trying to write to that.
Yeah, because then it's just a case of, I need to get them from here to there, and
also once the characters start talking to each other in the writing, I sort of find them taking things in different places, because you think, oh, actually that person's not going to do that. Why would that person agree to do that? So you just sort of see where the dialogue starts to take you, and suddenly you've wandered off a bit from the initial plan.
It is amazing. I mean, I've doubled with writing, or I did double writing in the past, and it's, for anyone that hasn't done it, it is quite amazing to yourself that when you're writing, kind of the story sometimes, like I said, it takes you places. It takes a life of its own, and what you end up with isn't necessarily what your idea was to begin with, isn't it? It's a fairly organic process.
And what's also quite funny, I mean, particularly with this book, is as I was writing it, I had my favorite characters, and there's a character in particular who's kind of one of these old sort of legends of the dungeon, called Sokobi the Trickster, and he's a bit wild and he's a bit unpredictable, and I thought this is always he was my guy, and then all the people who read it, I'd also put this this guy who was an elf in the party, just a young elf, and when I put him in, it was because I needed someone who was good at sword fighting. I thought, I'll make him an elf, you know. And then all the people who were reading it were coming back and saying, the elf is my favorite character. The elf is amazing. You've got to do more with the elf, you know. And I was like, I don't really like the elf. You know, find him a bit annoying. And the people who were sort of seeing early drafts were like, no, you have to do more with this guy. Which again was a bit of a oh, okay. But it just goes to show in a way, you know, you don't, once they're on the page, you know, you've got a bit of control over them, but once they're kind of out there, they kind of become their own people. And actually, you know, not many people really got on with the character who I thought was the best one in it. Not the best.
Your favorite one. So did you have any background, or have you dabbled with role-playing games? Because, you know, that notion of having, you know, the quintessential party, the 5-member party, the wizard, the fighter. Have you got any sort of background with that?
Well, now it's interesting because I know a lot about the games, and I used to have some of the games and all that stuff. But and this is going to sound appallingly sad, but it's like I never really had anyone to play them with. So
there's a problem.
I never got into the kind of big lore of Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. And but what I liked, a bit like when I watched the films and I'd make my own stories, I'd like the kind of like you say, some of the archetypes and things like that, and then making my own ideas up with them, you know, and taking them different places. So, you know, I'm not sure what someone who is sort of really into the tabletop games and stuff like that, you know, I think they'll recognize a lot in it. I felt like in some cases I didn't want to be drawing too much on, particularly with some of the creatures they might encounter. I didn't want to go out of my way to create something that I thought was incredibly new, that was actually probably like well established in, you know, Dungeons and Dragons lore. So I guess I used a lot of the tropes and a lot of the names, but without it's more stuff that, you know, kind of I think about in my head. My son's got into it in a big way, so, you know, that's great. And what's quite funny is I go to these. I mean, when he was younger, we used to go into these. They're not called Games Workshop anymore. They're called something else. But, you know, the shops with all
the old Games Workshop.
Yeah. But I'm sure they're called, anyway. You go in and they've got these amazing, you know, the models and the figures.
Yeah.
It was this like that. And the people who worked there would always talk to me. And I think it's something to do with being a guy in his 40s with a ponytail. They would all talk to me as though I knew everything about these games. Yeah. And I knew some of the names, and I knew some of the like a bit about like Warhammer and stuff like that. But they would always assume that I was this hardcore. No.
Because I don't know if anyone in the chat knows for my American audience. Because I don't know if Games Workshop is just a British institution or is it a bit more worldwide. Because I remember the first time I traveled to the UK, I think it was back in '93 or something like that. And we were living in a rented house in Oxford, and there was a Games Workshop, and I was like 13 at the time. I would just go to this shop, and it was incredible, like for a kid walking into Games Workshop for the first time. And they did games, like there was one day a week where you could go and play. And there was like little me with barely any English going to Games Workshop in Oxford and joining a game of Warhammer Fantasy, where it was just amazing.
And they sit there painting all the models and stuff like that. It's something else. I know they rebranded at one point. And I'm not sure what they're like in the States, but they're one of these things you just look at it and it all looks fantastic. It all
Yeah,
looks
yeah.
until you look at the price, and then
Well, yeah. But it is a British institution, isn't it? Along with shepherd's pie and real ale. Right. So I could take the conversation in a couple of directions, but just to round up with the whole genre of fantasy thing, I can't remember for the life of me who told me this, but it kind of made sense that when you're writing a fantasy novel, it does require a certain amount of prior knowledge from your reader. There's a whole, like you said, there's a whole lore around fantasy that when you drop, the words elf or goblin or whatever, you're presupposing a lot of knowledge already from the reader. And I don't know if maybe fantasy or geekdom is a bit more widespread these days than it was back in the 90s when I was a kid. But, if I had told anyone in my class there was a goblin and an elf, they would just confuse them. It would have been the same thing for them. So did you feel some sort of need to world build, or did you just get on with the story and let it be?
I think my approach to world building is I often have a sense of some of the sort of basic tenets of the world, which would describe. So for this one, magic is illegal. It's kind of medieval. Other than that, and they know what monsters are, but they wouldn't expect to see them. Then I like the world to kind of unfold as the protagonist or the narrator encounters it. Because if someone's living in a world where there are elves and they see an elf, they won't necessarily have a need to explain to themselves what an elf is. They're just going to go, oh, it's an elf. And I think you have to kind of bring that stuff in through other means. And I was quite aware of again, like the sort of deep lore that certain traditions have on what an elf is and I was thinking I want to point to some of those things. They live in forests. There's an idea that they've kind of been pushed into the forests and they don't go into human towns that much. There's a bit of a racial thing there. They tread very lightly. They're very quick. They're very nimble. And they have a little bit of magic about them. And in terms of the story, it's like, right, that's just need to get that much across, and then I'm very keen to, like I say, to sort of show that much and let readers do with that what they want in terms of, exactly how they look. I mean, part of this is maybe I'm just not a great writer, but, it's like, I don't want to spend ages describing someone. I don't want to spend ages doing. It's a bit different, There's other stories I've written where I did invent, new forms and new races, not in more of a sort of modern setting. And there it was, I was thinking, actually, this is really difficult to explain what these people are like and why someone who lived in a city would spend ages explaining that, that someone, someone had a massive eye, and this stuff. So I kind of put a glossary in the back of that story to explain that this is what they are. This is what they are, just so you know, because I don't want to interrupt the flow. But yeah, in this sense, it was. I think there is probably an assumption that since Lord of the Rings, I guess, we've got an idea of elves. It's sort of like you say, it's a bit more embedded in culture. I do remember there's a point where they encounter some goblins, and initially these were kobolds, kobolds, and I thought, I don't think anyone's going to know what that is.
Unless they play D&D. That's a very D&D thing.
This is going quite specifically, whereas Goblin, we kind of get what it is. So yeah, there was a bit of pulling back on that to make it more accessible. Also, I guess because for me, the interesting thing about the world, what was interesting to me and why I wanted to write a story about the world that I'd conceived was a bit more about the politics of it rather than who was in it.
Mm-hmm.
It was about what's the arrangement of power here and who, why can people do one thing and not another thing? I've always been fascinated by like the and maybe it's different in other countries, but from a very British perspective, the idea of everyone just walking around with weapons attached to them, and all being kind of like skilled fighters. It's like, would that be a particularly nice place to live? Was it all just a kind of a bit of a, we all know, so we all keep our weapons drawn. We don't want it, or would it be everyone jumping into a fight as soon as they can? It's like when you think when you're playing D&D or you're playing fighting fantasy or whatever, and it's like, do you really want to get into that fight? Because because you can actually die quite easily.
Yeah.
So I like to sort of play. What's the sort of everyday life politics about that? That doesn't make the book. The book doesn't spend a lot of time on that. I hasten to add, because it doesn't make it sound amazingly exciting. It's more that's just going on in the background. And like I say, I wanted to keep the monsters that you meet and the races that you meet fairly standard, so that you didn't get too dragged into that. It's more kind of suggested, I think.
So just to touch on a couple of things you said there, the actual title of the book is Vanisher.
Uh-huh.
And then it's Chronicles of the Warren.
Chronicles of the Warren, yeah.
So does it mean that there's potentially a series going on there? Are you keen to explore this world you've created in subsequent stories?
I do want to explore it more.
So Christmas 2025.
Yes. There's a sequel in the works, which it looks in a bit more detail at what underlies it all, if you see what I mean, and how. But also, I didn't particularly. One of the reasons I called it Chronicles of the Warren is because I didn't want to be particularly limited to take the story from that point and always move it forward, because I think there's a lot of questions about, and this goes back to when I used to trade stories with my friend Sari, and it was what happened in the past. Where did that person come from? What were they doing before they were an adventurer? And it just seemed like a good world to take a lot of half ideas I had for stories and some semi-developed stories, and I thought, actually, I can place that in there, and all revolving around this allure of basically dungeoneering, and adventuring, but adventuring in a world where there perhaps aren't the adventures that you would like to find.
I don't know. I'll happily keep on reading. Sign me up for the next one.
Oh, good. Pleased to hear that.
So, and then let's talk about the whole heist thing, because I love. I don't know in literature, but I love a good old heist movie. I mean, I think when I was a kid, the first movie that my dad allowed me to stay up at night, because school night, whatever. But we started watching The Sting, the one with Robert Redford and Paul Newman, and my dad was like, "No, you kind of stay out for this one. This one is," and I'm very, very fond of that movie. And then there's obviously the Ocean's 11 series. So did you draw inspiration from those movies?
Yeah, definitely. And also more recent ones, less classic, but things like Now You See Me, which is all about magicians and things like that. And that combined with, I also like short stories, right? So I always like the twist, and there's always a twist in the heist. There's always the bit where you're looking in one direction and you should have been looking over there. And when I was, if I'd sort of reached a point where it's like, I'm not quite sure where to go with this. Yeah, I'd go back to some of those classics, some of the Ocean's 11 or some of the Now You See Me or something like that.
The Prestige.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
That was another great one. That twist at the end as well.
Yeah, and what I like about the Prestige, and it's not so much with Vanisher, because Vanisher unfolds in a slightly different way. But something I always like with writing is when kind of the end of the book is almost in the first page. You know, you walk past something, and that's actually, you know, you've kind of walked past. I don't know if you know the film Labyrinth. You know, the Jim Henson Labyrinth film.
Or the one with David Bowie back in the last century.
Yes, and there's a bit where at the start she goes one way, and if she'd gone the other way, she'd go straight to where she needed to be. You know, this, and similarly with the Prestige, they get what the twist is really early on in the film, and they just go, "Oh no, that's silly. Move on from it." You know, so I love things like I love how twist it's, and you know, in a way, it's difficult if people are expecting a twist, but I think, you know, that's part of the challenge of writing. You know, you go through a few ideas. Could we do this? Could we do that? Could we? And then it's
so in my humble opinion, and for what it's worth, I think you pulled it off really well. I think that, you know, like I said, that twist at the very beginning with the groups getting together and the bit at the end, everything, I think you pulled it off. But I don't know if it's necessarily related, but because I was having a conversation a few weeks back with Christopher Rocchio and David Butler, and we were kind of discussing Game of Thrones, and they kind of came across as a bit dismissive of the sort of the shock value of that grimdark genre, because you can shock the reader once, but then once the shock becomes the expectation, like, where do you take your story? What can you do with it? But is there a difference between having a story with a twist and having this sort of subversion of expectations that everyone talks about these days? Is there a difference there, or are they kind of the same thing? Because you watch Game of Thrones, I suppose, or read the books. So for me, like, when Ned Stark dies, like, to the moment when the sword is coming down, I'm going, no, he's going to get saved. He's the good guy, right? And for me, when I read that scene on the page, it was like a game changer. It's like, okay, I'm reading something different here. But that wasn't necessarily a twist. That was just a subversion of the classic trope that the good guys eventually win and get. So But then you can only do that so many times, because then it sort of becomes predictable, I suppose. I don't know. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think also, I mean, it's funnily enough, having said not talk about work, that in the book I wrote on the philosophy of or the anti-philosophy of cliches, I called it, the shock of the same. I talked about reboots and rebooting series, and the big thing for. And what I was sort of noticing was the need. I'm going to get back to subversion of expectations, but the need, probably in the last 10, 15 years, to have the bad guys win, or have the bad guys sort of more dominant than they would be before. You know, I was thinking about things like Batman, you know, The Dark Knight Rises and all that, where actually you don't leave the cinema feeling like, hooray. You know, you feel like, oh my God, everything's quite bad and everyone's quite evil and all this kind of stuff. But what I find quite funny is they take it to such an extreme that you end up gifting the bad guys the same superhuman powers that the good guys used to have. You know, it's ridiculous how powerful they are. It's, you know, literally that there's just this sort of unending resources that the bad guys have, and I think that, you know, that then becomes more of a, you know, it falls into its own trap. It's trying not to be cliched, but it actually ends up creating a cliche of itself, and that's what I agree with you. You know, it's like if you are expecting the twist, then it's not a twist. For me, where the difference with the twist and the subversion of expectations are is if you're following the character, then and they do something that is actually in keeping with the character, but you may not have noticed it so much, then that's the twist. If it's a subversion of expectations, it's like actually they do something completely out of character, or the story does something completely out of character, and I think that's the difference for me. But I mean, you're right. I really like there's an American author called Edward Hoke, and he a few years ago I discovered he kind of rejuvenated my writing because like most people, I start a lot of stories. One of the reasons that I like writing these books for my son for Christmas is that I force myself to finish them. But I always imagine, you start writing and you think this is the first page of a 500-page epic, And Edward Hope writes short stories that are like 2 pages long.
Right.
And when I read that, I thought, well, I could just write a 2-page. That's amazing. I don't have to, I can just write as long as I want it to, as long as I want it to be. But he does a lot of locked room mysteries, and they're ingenious locked room mysteries, but you have to give them some space, because if you read them all in a row, you get the formula quite quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, you suddenly think, well, why has he mentioned that? Why has he done that? Why did he particularly point to that? Something's going on, and it's quite annoying because they're still ingenious, but it's only when you clump them all together. And so I think you've got to be quite sparing with your twists, because otherwise there's no investment in it. If people aren't trusting what you're saying, if people are expecting there to be a change, then they're going to be constantly,
Yeah.
Is there going to be something? I sort of find that with, what's the classic is the Michael Knight, Sixth Sense, that type of film. And every film he does, you're like, right, the twist is coming.
It becomes his trademark thing.
So then you're reading it, you're watching it rather looking for where the twist might be, which kind of can ruin the enjoyment a bit. So
you don't think that necessarily that's going to become kind of like a staple of your writing, that people necessarily aren't going to associate, oh, he's the next Tom Grimwood story, I'm going to read it because there's going to be like 2 or 3 good twists along the way?
I think I do like twists because I like short stories. I think if there was a kind of signature to the stories I write, it's usually there's quite a few different threads, and they'll come together at the end, but not always in a not always in the way you expect. Which is bizarrely kind of like the way I write philosophy as well. But for the stories, there's usually, I think you always have to have an epic end. You always have to have the stirring music in the background and all that kind of stuff. That's the way you want to feel there's a payoff for the work you've done reading it. And if that payoff is a twist, then that's great. And if the payoff is a fantastic battle, that's good as well. But I like, or I've been told anyway, that when I'm sort of laying things out, you're often asking people, remember that thing that happened. Remember that thing that happened a few chapters back. Okay, that in mind, that's gonna be important again.
That's the old Chekhov's gun, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Chekhov's gun. Yeah.
What was I going to say next? I was going to say something. It happens all the time. Anyway, it'll come back to me, because I would recommend, because it's an unfortunate series that I don't know if we're going to see finished, but it's the The Gentleman Bastards by Scott Lynch.
Mm.
And it's meant to be this sort of 7-book fantasy thing, but it's got that sort of heist element to them. So particularly the first novel, The Lies of Loch Lamora, and the second one, Red Seas Over Red Skies. It's a fantasy world, and it's this group of thieves always trying to pull up a job, and there's always that twist at the end, and thoroughly enjoyable. So I think if you haven't checked them out, I would certainly highly recommend the first book, because it can be read as a standalone, and it's probably right up your street. And it's come back to me. That's it. So this author you were mentioning, Andrew Hope, is that pardon?
Edward Hope.
Edward Hope. Sorry, Edward Hope. Is this some sort of collection of his stories that has been published? Is it some way to grab hold of them?
Yes, I've completely forgotten. It's on my shelf as well. There's a few collections of his stories. It's from the sort of that a lot of the stuff is kind of 1950s, 1960s. There's a bit of sci-fi, and there's a bit of detective, and there's a bit of lock room mysteries and all and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I've forgotten what the best one is, but Edward Hoch is how you spell his name.
Okay,
but thoroughly recommended.
Okay, I'll have a look. Brilliant. I suppose sort of last point there. So the decision to go into a fantasy setting, was that influenced by, I don't know, have you got like a particular love for the genre, or are you one of these kids that grew up reading that sort of thing, or are you more from the fighting fantasy novels?
I think it's a good question. I mean, the two authors I really loved as a kid, and I still love, is Anne Pilling had this brilliant trilogy about some kids who basically go on holiday and encounter supernatural forces. And Chris Westwood, who wrote a book called A Light in the Dark, which I remember reading as a kid and not thinking that much of, but it just stuck in my head. And I reread it a bit later. And I thought, this is really good. Again, there's a massive twist in it, which when you reread it, it's really obvious. but as a kid, I was like, no. And what they did was take normal situations, very normal situation, family holiday, or just a guy living in a bit of a rundown community, and add a bit of magic into it. And I guess what I'm always interested in, sort of maybe building on that, is creating slightly odd, slightly strange worlds and putting essentially normalish people in them, So I think, obviously, the people in Vanisher all have their own histories and things like that, but they're not necessarily jumping at the chance to go on an adventure or go on. So they're not your sort of, the protagonist Azra is not going there because she wants to, make her famous name. Essentially, she's just kind of on the run because no one really wants her. And the fantasy genre gives you that opportunity to do it without trying to, it cuts down the amount you have to explain about why there might be magic, or why there might be. Where's this come from? Why is there an elf walking down the street? Well, we know it's a fantasy world, so that's kind of all right. I think to an extent, all the stuff I write, you could call fantasy. There's always a bit of an element of, it's definitely not like social realism or anything like that. This is the most overtly fantasy novel that I've written. So I think it's less being a big fan of fantasy, although I am a fan of fantasy. I like, love Tolkien. I love, I love a lot of authors like that. I love Ursula Le Guin, people like that. But it's more that the the story I wanted to tell just worked in the fantasy world, you know, better than trying to put it in some other kind of world.
Mm-hmm.
And it allowed the story to be told in a particular way and at a particular pace. So I think that's why I went for the fantasy world there. But, you know, there's also something, I mean, there's something really liberating about world building, you know, and having a bit of, this is how I want the world to be, and we're gonna have a few rules, but then we're gonna play around with those rules, you know. So
yeah, that's the thing. Like, you know, the old, you know, advice of you write about what you know. Well, no one knows your fantasy world better than you, isn't it? It's,
yeah.
Makes it easy. And so it just got a very prosaic question, and just changing topic radically. What's your because I've interviewed a few authors that work with Collective Ink, but we've never really talked about the business side of things. So how does it work with them? Like, have you got a deal for just the one book, or have you managed to have a deal for a number of books? How does that work?
It's just the one book,
Right.
the one book at the moment. But I think I find the way they work very transparent. I've worked with quite a few publishers with nonfiction. I think some of the, you know, when you think about like the sort of bigger fiction publishers, it's very, you know, it's very obscure how some people get somewhere, and, you know, I think a lot of things come into it. I think with Collective Ink, it's very transparent. It's, you know, they're very clear on what they want to hear from you and what you want to put forward. They're very clear on what the sort of contractual details are. You work with the same people the whole way through, and that's, you know, that's really refreshing. When I work with a bigger publisher for some books, again, non-fiction, and you spend ages working with someone up to a certain point, and then they completely disappear and someone else comes in, you know, and it's like you've built this relationship with like an editor, a series editor, and then you get passed on to someone else who's probably not read your book, and they're, you know, they're sort of you know, and so I find that the Collective Ink way of working, yeah, much more personable. Even though it's done through a lot of online communication, it's much more personable than some of the publishers that I work with.
No need for a law degree and a gun, right?
No, exactly. It's all very straightforward, and all that kind of what I'd call the under the bonnet stuff is you can access it all. You know, you can see sales, you can see what marketing they've done, you can see the reviews you know, you get the reviews that of the, when they're considering your title, you see the reviews that they've written, you see who's done the reviews, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's, you know, it's quite like I say, it's quite refreshing to have that level of transparency.
And so you don't have to deal with an agent in order to work with them.
No, which was another big pull, because well, you know, when I've tried to get fiction published before, it's slightly different, because like it was the first thing the agent wants to know is what's the genre and what's the sell, you know, which is a fair enough question to ask. A lot of the stuff I was writing, it's like I'm not really sure what to, you know, what I call this. I don't know. It's just something that's entertained me, and I think it's good, and I think it'll entertain other people. So, you know, having to do a kind of stock pitch and that kind of stuff, which you have to do when you're approaching agents. Like I say, Collective Ink was slightly different. It's a bit more laid out. It's a bit less elevator pitch style. I think there's more space to, you know, more space and time given to read your ideas. You know, I don't want to be unfair to other publishers or, you know, particular agents, but like I say, they accept unsolicited stuff, and that's, you know, that's great.
No, I mean, and I think there's a silly amount of books being published every year.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So, to be honest, just to get noticed, just to get seen, is short of a miracle. But I think this year, I think it's been 3 books that I've received from Collective Ink for review and so on. And I think the 3 people that I've read, they're all academics. So is that just coincidence, or
it's tough in higher education at the moment. Maybe we're all just looking for looking for second jobs.
Because both Dirk Strasser and Eric Goodwin, which are both authors that I sort of received the books from Collective Ink, they're both scholars. Dr. Goodwin in the US and Dirk Strasser in Australia. So is there some sort of link there, or is it just happenstance?
I wouldn't want to say. But and certainly I would not want to suggest that it's easier for academics to write books because we live in a fantasy world all the time. I wouldn't want to say that at all.
No, of course not.
No.
And then, so what's the relationship like? So, because did you have to fight with the editor?
Not at all. Not at all. There were no additions that they wanted. It was a very straightforward process, which surprised me a lot. But when I should say when I worked with Zero, who were also in Collective Ink for The Problem Was Stupid, the editorial support was really good there in terms of making very helpful suggestions. And some discussions on, do we need to promote this more? Do you need to highlight this more? Less that. With Vanisher, it pretty much went straight through, I think, which is probably more testament to the people who saw earlier drafts and made comments, I think, than I'm terrible at drafting my own work. I'm not good at. Again, perhaps because I like to read quickly and that, I'm not very good at going back over the stuff I've written and, highlighting it. So I often need other people to point out to me, maybe you need to do a bit more there.
But I think we talked before, I don't know if it was before we went live, about there must be a difference to reacting to feedback from your academic writing to your fiction writing, because you said, in your world of social philosophy, usually the people that want to talk to you are the ones that want to tell you why you're wrong.
Yeah.
So you're kind of ready, armor and shield, waiting for it. Whereas, how did that differ from getting feedback for this book?
So
there's a bit more vulnerable, or a bit more.
Yeah, there's a bit of a continuum. When you're publishing journal articles and you're reviewed by other academics, that's usually it's got better over the years, but that's usually when you get the harshest criticism and editorial comments. When you approach academic publishers, they're usually much nicer, and but there's still that element of criticism.
But sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Really sorry. But is it less personal when you're doing academic writing?
That's what
you don't have an emotional investment in the work per se.
Yeah, I do. I think it's probably similar in terms of criticism of the academic work compared to the fiction work. I would probably say, though, that it's easier to take criticism of my fiction work. Because I'm not a professor of fiction writing. I'm someone who likes writing stories, and if people are entertained by those stories, then that's brilliant. And I think people will be entertained. I think people will like the book. I think That's why I put it forward to get published. That's why, you know. But if people don't like it, there's any number of reasons they might not like it. You know, it might not be to their taste. They might not like the writing style. That, you know, all this kind of stuff. I think with the academic writing, you are specifically trying to change someone's mind, you know? and you know, when that gets misinterpreted or misread, or you get a criticism that you don't think is fair, then it probably stings a little bit more, because you think, you know, they haven't read it right. Whereas I think for my fiction, I'm you know, like I say, people not reading it in the way I intended it actually made it a better book, because they came back and said, oh, you know, do more with that character, or do, you know, tell me more about where that person came from. So you would have thought it would be the other way, because the fiction stuff is like my world, right? That's the escape point. That's getting away from it. But, you know, I mean, I'm saying that, I don't know. I'll tell you, but with a really harsh review, then I might be reduced to tears.
Yeah. But I'll tell you why I think it was the other way around. But I think it's probably my own bias, because I studied in the UK, and my background is economics. So that when you're writing a dissertation about economics, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're sort of dealing with facts, and you're trying to explain, I don't know, inflation, interest rates, exchange rates, analyzing the workings of a central bank. It's sort of fairly factual. Whereas I don't know if in your field, if it's more about ideas, which are less tangible, there is a greater emotional investment into your way of thinking. Or like you said, you're trying to make someone... If Brexit was an economic disaster for the UK, that's quite... we cannot argue about it.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas, you know, it is, you know, it's happened. Yeah. These things have happened. We can see the consequences. So you cannot argue about it. In your field, is it more just ideas and concepts that are more open to discussion?
I think part of it is, so what drives a lot of... you know how you never know things that you write, what's going to come back and haunt you. And I found out quite recently that something I said almost as a throwaway comment to a few people was being preached in different universities. It was, you know, when you're doing research, either do it on something you love or do it on something that really pisses you off. And I've always done my research on things that piss me off, that I have an emotional investment in some way. You know, like I've got an interest in. A lot of things piss me off, you know, but I'm not, you know, I'm not going to write on. But if I see something and I think that could be better, you know. So if I'm writing on, you know, I do a lot of work, like I said, on health and social care, and I see some of the ways that research is applied in health, and I think that's the wrong kind of research. You know, you're looking at the wrong thing, you're missing the point. And that, you know, that makes me annoyed, and I want to write about it, and I want to persuade people that you know, that not necessarily they're wrong, but there are different ways to look at it and things like that. So it starts from a position of addressing a wrong, okay?
Right.
Whereas I think with the fiction, it's always, you know, it's to entertain myself, you know. And like I say, it's a bit like, I mean, I play music as well, you know. I write music. It's not to everyone's taste. I think it's good, and ultimately I think, you know, it's like, well, if other people like it, then that's fantastic. And I think, you know, I think it's good enough for other people to like it, but ultimately, if I've made me happy, you know, I've made, and if I walked in on my son reading a book I'd written for him once, and he was just getting to the last page, and he was doing this. He might be watching, so he might be embarrassed of this, but he was reading it, and he was going, and I remember I just saw it through the door, and I you know,
yes,
it's the those are the people that you want to be entertained by it, right? Now, if more people are entertained by it, brilliant. But actually, those are the people I want entertained by it.
Yeah.
It's different with the academic work because it's like you're taking on, you're taking on a bigger audience, but also you're addressing an injustice. I didn't start writing because I thought, the way people were writing wasn't very good. I was reading books and thinking, I don't quite, if this was a bit like this and a bit like, what if it was like this, and wrote it for myself. And I thought, I like that, but it wasn't something that I wouldn't go and tell someone else that they were writing wrong, or telling stories wrong, except maybe, I don't know, Dan Brown or someone like that might tell him.
No, but, but back to your cliches thing, a writer is someone who cannot not write. So, I've got a question for you. Again, just jumping from topic to topic, and maybe we can leave it here if you want, because maybe you are the right person to ask. You expressed a like or endearment for Ursula Le Guin. I never got the hype behind the Earthsea books. I've read the first 4. I think there was one that came out relatively recently, but and people, no, the Oriental philosophy behind it. This, that. It's like I do not get. What did I miss? What's so great about Earthsea?
I can't answer that. I remember as a 11-year-old picking up, I think it was the second book. It was the one for the first 3/4.
I was trying to see, because I've got them all down. I was trying to figure out.
It's one. It starts with a girl in a convent.
Tehanu? Is it Tehanu? Hang on.
I'm not sure. It's.
So I just got that edition of the 4 first ones in one paperback.
I remember I picked it up from the school library because I like the picture on the front cover.
Tombs of Atuan?
I honestly can't remember because it was a while back that I read it. But for the first 3/4 of the book, nothing happens. Right?
Yeah.
Nothing happens. It's just a girl living in a convent and having a bit of a bad time. And then suddenly the main character from the previous book turns up in a sort of surprising way, and they escape together. And I remember it was one of those things that when I was reading it, a bit like Chris Westwood, I was reading it, it was like, all right, it's a story. This is quite tedious. And then I was thinking to myself, but why do I keep reading this? Why do I keep reading this? And it wasn't to do with like the deeper meaning or anything like that. It was to do with every so often what I found Le Guin's really good at is it's throwing in things that kind of keep you interested. Well, not you obviously, but can keep you interested. So it's a girl living in a convent, nothing's happened, and then suddenly I remember she says, you've got it. The chief nun comes and says, you have to see the prisoners today. And she gets taken to a cave and there's prisoners and they've had their tongues cut out, and that image, because it's so jarring with what else they've got, it's it just keeps you, something's going on here, something's happening, but I can't, the character's not seeing it and I'm not seeing it, but it's gonna happen. And I think what I took from Ursula Le Guin was, that's how you world build, not with a big long, I mean, it's fine, if people have maps in their books, brilliant, love that, and all that sort of stuff. But actually, you detail someone's everyday life, and you throw in the little bits that make it a different world. But yeah, in terms of all the deeper stuff, I don't know. I try and switch my mind off sometimes with that. Although I have to say, what I get, I mean, I was meant to write. I never got around to writing it, but the worst thing for me is when I watch really bad horror movies. They have some of the most amazing philosophy in them.
Yeah.
Write a book on the philosophy of bad horror movies. There was a publisher who was really interested in that, but I couldn't quite justify it to myself. It, sort of takes 6 months of melting my brain watching movies.
Take one for the team.
And I couldn't justify it to my boss either. Of like, what are you working on right now? Tombs of Atuan. That's
it. Was Tomb of Atuan. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Right. I think we're gonna leave it here. It's been thoroughly enjoyable talking to you. So thank you very much for popping in tonight.
Thank you.
No. It's always a pleasure. Like I said before, it's always the end of the week. It's Friday. We're all tired, but I think this sort of thing is so. I never regret it. Before we go, where can people find your work, your books, whatever you want to self-promote? Go ahead.
So I hate to say the word Amazon, but if you do go on Amazon and you look for Tom Grimwood, there's an author page that has all my books on it. If you search Tom Grimwood Cumbria, you'll find my staff profile page, which has all my publications on it, and also my email address. And if you want to, like I say, if you want to access any of the papers that find interesting, I worked out a few years ago that interesting titles were the key to.
No, I think you got a knack. You got a knack for that. Yeah.
So please do get in touch if you want to read read any of those things or talk about any of those things. And like I say, Vanisher is out on the 28th of January. You can get it through the Collective Ink website, or you can get it through Amazon or any reputable bookseller who is worth their weight.
Fantastic. Well, once again, thank you very much to you, Tom, and all the people that were lurking in the chat there. Everyone, take lots of care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.